Thank you, Don. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, everybody, for logging in to uh, join this discussion of Indigenous people and how they are portrayed on stamps. Uh, the first part of it is mainly going to focus on earlier representations, and then the second part is going to focus on how the U.S. has has shown Indigenous peoples on its stamps. So I am going to share my screen and have a PowerPoint, also have a YouTube video that I will be playing. We tried it out earlier and it seemed to work okay, and I hope it will. Okay, so first, a definition of what we mean by Indigenous peoples. And I think there's nothing very surprising here. They are, the original settlers of various lands around the earth. And in some cases, their histories and their cultures have been well preserved. And in other cases, they they have lived or settled areas that later were colonized, principally by Europeans. And often there is a Western overprint on their cultures. And maintaining cultural identity can be quite a challenge for Indigenous peoples, especially in those that have cultures that date back centuries and are now trying to maintain those in the 21st century. Okay, so we're going to start with go on to the YouTube video here. It lasts about 10 minutes, and then we'll get back to some PowerPoint slides. The diversity of humankind extends far beyond definitions of race and nationality. There are more than 370 million Indigenous peoples belonging to more than 5,000 groups, each further distinguished by culture, tradition, and often nuances of appearance. Each Indigenous group is recognized as such because of its origin from the first peoples to inhabit its geographic area. How much do we know about Indigenous peoples? How well do we understand who they are? And how have stamps contributed to our knowledge? On September 13th, 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This act brought to fruition more than 20 years of discussion within the UN involving nations and Indigenous groups. The Declaration sets a framework for peace and justice based upon mutual recognition and respect, and highlights the importance of the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Let's begin our philatelic exploration. Our so-called knowledge of Indigenous peoples is most likely to be a passing familiarity with the handicrafts that help define them. We collect these objects or see them in museums, and they lend themselves to strikingly beautiful stamp images. Other important aspects, including clothing and ceremonial objects, are no less collected, admired, and featured on stamps. Nonetheless, figural art, masks, distinctive clothing, are most likely to be, in our minds, disembodied from the people who created and used these and to whose cultures they were integral. An examination of actual Indigenous peoples on stamps begins with the earliest depictions of monarchs of independent Pacific Islands, including King Kamehameha III of Hawaii in 1853. Subsequently, stamps depicted Laupepa, the Malietoa or King of Samoa, and King George I of Tonga. But note that these images, although of Indigenous people, all exhibit westernized dress. Other 19th century stamps occasionally depicted generalized images of Indigenous peoples. The first to show a person of African origin is the Diego Suarez stamp with a profile of what may have been a Malagasy. The elaborately designed United States newspaper stamp is described as depicting an Indian maiden. This is perhaps the first stamp to show an Indigenous person in traditional dress, although tribal affiliation is not indicated. Among the United States postage stamps, the first possibly showing indigenous people is the 1869 stamp depicting the landing of Columbus based upon the painting by John Vanderlyn. His work shows Arawak people in the imaginative forest at the right and what appear to be two kneeling individuals at the left, but these are either cropped or indistinguishable in the stamp image. The subsequent use of a design based upon the same painting for the 2-cent Columbian Exposition, commemorative in 1892, includes the faint image of at least one Arawak at the far right. Although Vanderlyn's painting portrayed little detail of the Arawaks, the later work, Columbus Presenting Natives by Luigi Gregori, showed several Arawaks whom Columbus had taken back to the Spanish court. Their appearance, or at least that of their headdresses, is consistent with early published images of Arawaks. Seth Eastman's painting, Buffalo Chase, the basis for the 4-cent Trans-Mississippian stamp, accurately shows North American Plains Indians, but lacks information about tribal affiliation. The first identified Native American on a United States stamp was the Senecomica princess Pocahontas. She married English explorer John Rolfe, who took her to England, where Simon van de Pas completed the only known contemporary portrait 1 year before her death. Considered by many to be among the most beautiful United States stamps, the 14-cent value of the 1922 issue depicts an American Indian. But here, the actual subject is a historically known leader in traditional costume, Chief Hollow Horned Bear of the Boulé Sioux. He is simply not recognized as such on the stamp inscription. Beyond the United States, stamp images of indigenous peoples are found on issues of European colonies from the late 19th century through the middle 20th century and sometimes later. The earliest of these are the 1893 and 1894 issues of the French Red Sea port of Obock. The beautiful triangle stamps feature images that leave the impression of having been taken directly from photographs of Somali tribespeople. Although lacking in fine detail, the 1894 Obock stamps show a candid appearing group of Somalis, and the stunning image has a very photographic feeling, embodying facial expressions and postures that connote genuine social interaction. It may be considered the best early contemporary depiction of an indigenous group. Into the early 20th century, colonial stamps increasingly depicted images of their indigenous habitants and their lifestyles. These included other photographic-like scenes, although those of French colonies, such as the marketplace in Dakar, Senegal, portray the greatest sense of realism. The depiction of faces is relatively rare into the mid-20th century, except in French colonial stamps, and identification of tribal affiliations such as the Maori of New Zealand or the Dayak of Borneo is often lacking. Nonetheless, whether the distinctive aspect is the texture of hair, facial features, tattoos, or head coverings, these stamps all show one or more features that would characterize an indigenous group. Indigenous groups typically have cultural traditions that contribute to their identity. Depictions of dance, ceremonial and daily attire, and music are important reflections of group identity and cohesion. Even when the group is not identified, the image reflects a group's culture and has the ability to emotionally transport the viewer to that place, time, and performance. Other stamps showing work by people typically focus on agricultural products such as cocoa and rubber, or the creation of goods such as textiles. These may be specific to a particular locale, and when they are, they reflect the influence of climate, flora, and fauna on the defining characteristics of an indigenous group. Similarly, activities such as hunting may depict other aspects of people in addition to the act of hunting. The geography of indigenous groups dictates much about them and the physical limits of their existence. Forms of transportation may be particular to a group, and island, coastal, or inland desert environments define the limits of movement in and about their native land. With more than 5,000 indigenous groups, including distinct tribes within former colonies, depictions on stamps of indigenous peoples and their cultures has been little changed through the late 20th century. The 2007 United Nations Declaration has brought new attention to indigenous peoples of the world, and in 2009, the UN Postal Administration issued the first series of stamps depicting indigenous people. These dramatic and engaging photos with their splashes of color by designing artist Stephen Bennett highlight just a small part of the incredible human diversity about which most of us know so little. The 2010 United Nations Indigenous Peoples stamps continue the beautiful artistic renderings of Bennett. They draw the viewer's attention to this diversity of facial features, hairstyles, and adornment, which are only a small part of the many physical and cultural aspects that define each group. Most recently, Bangladesh recognized its 5 most populous indigenous groups with stamps featuring 4 images representing each group. Showing facial features, attire, work, and cultural events, it is the most comprehensive portrayal of indigenous peoples by any country. The indication at the bottom of the sheet that this is the first phase holds promise for subsequent important issues like this. We live in an ever increasingly complex world, and the people and cultures of indigenous groups are at risk for homogenization as implied by Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. Although some groups are populous and robust, others are small and fragile, and the extinction of the Bow tribe of the Andaman Islands in 2010 heralded the loss of a culture and language. But there is cause to celebrate and a need to help to preserve this fragile diversity. Greater recognition and understanding of cultures, especially those of indigenous peoples, gives each of us a way to better enjoy and appreciate the beauty of humankind.
Okay. Right. So this is something that I have gotten interested in through a lot of travel, and whenever I go to a different country, I usually, read up on history, and it's really has become quite a fascination for me. One thing I will add is that the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, at the time that it was brought up for a vote in the UN General Assembly, there were 4 nations that very distinctively voted against it, voted against adopting that. And those nations were Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. And so when you think of those 4 countries, I mean, they all have really significant indigenous populations. And some of if you read the Declaration, there are some recommendations in it. Of course, it has no legal binding, but there's some declarations in it that I think those 4 countries found uncomfortable as far as providing benefits and advantages to their indigenous populations. Okay, so now I want to talk about indigenous peoples on US stamps. And these are not necessarily going to be in chronological order, but I am recognizing that the date when the stamp appeared. And we do have to start out chronologically with the arrival of humans in the Americas, crossing the Bering Land Bridge when sea level was lower during the ice ages. And and I love this cachet just because they have incorporated the design of the person on the stamp into the design of the cachet. And as it says, the great herds of Ice Age mammoth moved eastward and the mammoth hunters followed with no idea that soon they would be living on a new continent. And I just love that statement. Obviously they had no idea, but we know that humans arrived in the Americas at least 30,000 years ago, if not as much as 40 to 50,000 years ago, as more and more remains are found and archaeological sites are found. Those dates are continually being updated. So these are two of the stamps that were mentioned in the video. The Pocahontas stamp of 1907 for the 300th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown. And then the 14-cent definitive from the 1922-23 definitive series showing a also a historical figure, Chief Hullhorn Bear. There have been other historical representations related to American Indians. Certainly in 1934, we had in the National Park series, the Mesa Verde stamp. And then also the same year, the stamp honoring the French arrival on the shores of Green Bay with Father Nicholas. Now, here's something that I think most of us are familiar with historically from the presidencies ranging from Andrew Jackson to James K. Polk, were times of forced displacement of American Indian tribes from the southeastern U.S. into what at that time and was until I think 1912, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And so you can see which tribes were the principal ones that were moved and where they ended up in Oklahoma. This whole time of migration, as we all know, was brutal as far as the survival of the Indians who were being forced to move. An enormous loss of life, and it has become known as the Trail of Tears. And in 1948, the US issued a stamp. The stamp very kind of benignly says that it was just the arrival of the 5 civilized Indian tribes in Oklahoma. And most of the caches that you see, the first day caches for this, have that same kind of Eurocentric sentiment to them, or no sentiment rather. But this is one that I found that actually, where the creator of the cache actually said, used the term Trail of Tears and the enforced migration of the 5 civilized Indian tribes to Oklahoma. So that's, I thought was very significant at that time in 1948. Perhaps not a very popular thought at that time. But most of our representations of indigenous peoples in the US are what we see in a lot of foreign stamps, arts and crafts. And as I mentioned in the video, these, as attractive as these are, they really are disembodied from the people who created them and the people who used them. And that's something that, I mean, I love that we have these beautiful stamps, but in some cases, there is really insufficient identification of the tribal origin. Friend of mine who's an archaeologist here at the University of Tennessee, works on American Indian archaeology. He also pointed out that in the mask stamps, that 2 of those tribes do not inhabit the US. They are a little farther to the north in Canada, in the Pacific Northwest. But it struck me in creating this slide that there is a major type of art and craft that we associate with Indians that has never been represented on US stamps: baskets. And so I don't know why we fell short on that one, because I think for many people that's one of the certainly a very iconic type of art and practical use that we associated with American Indians. We do have some other stamps that have been issued. The headdress stamps, I like those especially because the tribal affiliation is indicated on the left side of each stamp. But then we have the strip of 32-cent stamps showing dances. The dances are named, and I like these. I like the images because they actually show people involved in a cultural activity, but the tribal affiliations of the different dances are not indicated. And from my limited actual knowledge of American Indian tribes, all I could say is that the one that is the second from the right would be a Pacific Coast tribe of some sort. By the way, I probably should mention, I was born and grew up in northwestern Missouri, and we learned a lot about the Plains Indians in school throughout school, really. And so that's, I have to say, that's also one of my interests here. But we really can't talk about Indigenous people in the United States without, well, I got ahead of myself. Okay, that slide is coming up soon, but some other US stamps that have had American Indian themes, 4 of the stamps in the Great Americans issue. Sequoia, of course, is famous in Southeast US Cherokee history, and his syllabary, the book that translated Cherokee into English, we actually have a copy of that here in the University of Tennessee Library in our special collections. Then we had the Historic Legends of the West sheet that came out in 1994. There are 4 stamps, 1 on each row, that are relevant to Indigenous peoples. The ceremonial dance in the upper right, Chief Joseph on the far left of the second row, Geronimo in the middle of the third row, and Sacagawea second to the right in the bottom row. Of course, Sacagawea also had been depicted but not identified in the 1954 Lewis and Clark exposition commemorative. So in addition to this, and my friend, the archaeologist, pointed it out to me, he said, well, have you included Stan Waddy in your presentation? I said, who is Stan Waddy? And he said, well, he's a Cherokee who was a Confederate general. And the stamp showing Stan Waddy is on the Civil War sheet, similar in format to this. More recently, we have had other additional artwork, including a basket, or actually 2 baskets, that appeared in the sheetlet, The Art of the American Indian. And I will point out to you that the oldest artifact on this sheet in the lower left says Mississippian effigy. That is pre-Columbian, and that is a stone carving that is located in our campus museum here at the University of Tennessee. And so I remember the first day, it was all very hush-hush until about a week or 2 before, and then it was announced that so we had our own first day ceremony here. We had maximum cards and cachets with the Postal Service. They had first days all around in 10 different places in the US for that. And they actually broke up a very large number of sheets and sent a large number of the particular stamp to each site for their first day ceremony. And then earlier, prior to that, in 1997, as part of the dolls set, there was an American Indian doll. We have some historical people that have been modern historical people shown on U.S. stamps, only two. Will Rogers, who appeared in 1948 and 1979 stamps, and football player Jim Thorpe in 1984. This is what I was jumping ahead to. So if we're going to talk about indigenous peoples in the U.S., we have to include Hawaii, and with stamps showing King Kamehameha in 1937, Hawaiian territorial recognition, 1959 statehood, and then the National Parks Centennial Celebration 1972. We have the City of Refuge in Hawaii with a carved wooden idol. And then in 2002, famous surfer, Duke Kahanamaku. And so we have a limited representation of indigenous peoples on stamps representing Hawaii. So if you like human culture, you definitely, if you're not already a member of ATA, then this is where you belong. And if you are a member of ATA, maybe you'll become interested in looking at some of the checklists that we have for the many, many aspects of human culture that characterize that are offered in our checklist series. And you know, Native American, I just kind of combed through the list the other day when I was making the slide. Native American culture, 842 different listings, folklore and legends, which will include both indigenous and Eurocentric, jazz, which will include some indigenous musicians there, religious symbols, and tattoos. And there are many more. These are just a few that I picked out, and with some examples that I selected that represent human culture. Not suggesting that the Gibson girl was indigenous, but it's such a beautiful stamp. I had to put that on there. Everything else here, though, represents indigenous people. But that is it, and I look forward to discussions or comments, questions.